Russell Mulcahy was born in Melbourne, Australia, and grew up with the love of film. When he was 14, he received a camera, which he used to make short films with his friends. This eventually led to him getting a job working as an editor for Australia's 7 network, where he honed his skills as an editor and director. One day in the early 1970s, he was contacted by a producer at 7, who asked him to put together a film clip to go along with the song Everybody's Talkin' by Harry Nilsson. This was long before the term music video was used, and while not the first, they still were fairly uncommon. This was a hit, and Mulcahy moved on to not just editing, but also directing these videos. As the medium grew in popularity, so did the demand for the director, as he worked with bands like AC/DC and the Saints. Wanting to expand his reach, he moved to England, where he directed videos for Culture Club, XTC, and The Vapors. In 1979, he directed The Buggles with Video Killed the Radio Star, which they shot in one day. The video ended up becoming a milestone in music history, as it was the first video played on MTV when they launched August 1st, 1981. Mulcahy was a frustrated filmmaker. He wanted to be making features, but all the offers he was getting was for music videos. Australian native producer Hal McElroy had been developing films since the 1970s with movies like The Cars That Ate Paris and Picnic at Hanging Rock. He'd been watching music videos, and every time he saw one that was amazing, he called to find out who directed it. Time and time again, it was Russell Mulcahy. McElroy had recently read the novel Razorback by Peter Brennan. He loved the book, and seeing the overwhelming success of Jaws, which was also adapted from a novel, he thought this would be a fantastic monster to bring to the big screen. Razorbacks are large feral pigs. The novel was about an abnormally large razorback that was causing a wave of death and destruction across the Australian outback. McElroy contacted the special effects artist Bob McCarran and asked if he could design a giant pig about the size of a rhino. McCarran had just finished working on the sequel to Mad Max, The Road Warrior, and got to work on this request. McElroy worked on a deal with Warner Brothers to help finance the film as well as distribute in the US. He said the advance they received was great. McElroy saw the Duran Duran video for Hungry Like the Wolf and looked up who directed it. Again, it was Russell Mulcahy. He was talking to someone who said, "You know he's Australian, right?" That settled it. McElroy contacted Mulcahy and said, "Do you want to direct a horror feature in Australia?" Mulcahy jumped at the opportunity. He said yes, then paused, and asked what the movie was about. McElroy responded, "A giant killer pig." Mulcahy said, "Great!" He was editing Elton John's I'm Still Standing video, and once that was done, he flew to Australia to start working on the movie. They hired writer Everett DeRoach to adapt the novel to a screenplay. DeRoach had recently written the script for the exploitation film Road Games. McElroy worked with DeRoach on the screenplay, and apparently, a large portion of the book wouldn't work, so they just took the basics from it and built the script around that. To shoot the film, they hired Dean Semler to be the director of photography. Semler had just shot The Road Warrior in locations around Australia, so he was the right man to work on a film taking place mostly in the outback. Looking into casting, Mulcahy suggested Jeff Bridges for the lead. At the time, Bridges had done quite a few movies and TV shows, but wasn't very well known yet. The executives at Warner Brothers didn't consider him a star. The studio wanted someone with more international appeal. As luck would have it, at the time, actor Gregory Harrison was in Australia on a surfing trip. He came there on vacation and told his agent to keep an ear out for any jobs he might audition for while he was there. Harrison was starring in the hugely popular show Trapper John MD, and they thought he would be better for the film overall. Harrison got a call and went to meet with McElroy. He pitched the film as Jaws on Land, and Harrison was intrigued. He grew up on Catalina Island off the coast of Los Angeles, and the island was infested with razorbacks. He liked the idea that there could be one that was a monster killer. He also thought this could be his chance to go from TV star to movie star. Archie Whiteley was hired to play Sarah. She had just been in The Road Warrior as the captain's girl. For Carl's wife Beth, they hired actress Judy Morris. She was an Australian who would be playing an American. She was excited to do the movie because she thought it would be fun. Her role was essentially a small setup, with her investigating kangaroo poachers, which led to her getting mauled to death by the razorback. They needed 2 very eccentric characters to play the Outback brothers, Benny and Dicko. So they hired Chris Haywood and David Argue. As for the old hunter, they hired Bill Kerr to play Jake Cullen. For many of the extras, they just planned to hire a bunch of locals. When Mulcahy met with McCarran to see the razorback he created, he said he liked it, but asked if it could be bigger. McCarran agreed, and they made the beast huge. McCarran and his team developed numerous razorbacks for the film. They had about 7 total. To build the beast, they searched for the largest pig in Australia. It was big, but only about a quarter the size of a rhino. It was roughly the size of a Shetland pony. They had to fix the look of the pig. Even though it was very big, its breed was hairless, so it wasn't as intimidating as they had envisioned. They had a veterinarian knock it out, so they were able to make a life cast of the animal. They made a full-body latex suit, covered in patches of fur, and fake tusks they could put on the pig for various shots. The pig really didn't like the suit. They had a fully animatronic head they could use for the close-ups. It took 8 people to animate the head. They had 2 ramming pigs, both made on a solid steel frame. One ramming pig was placed on a dolly, which they could drive into things. The other was built to be fired out of a cannon to go through things, like the house in the beginning of the movie. They wanted something even more impressive, so they requested that McCarran build a full-sized Razorback that could run. McCarran said it couldn't be done, but they insisted, so the effects team got to work. They built this giant animatronic pig that weighed half a ton. They borrowed a forklift from the company next door so they could move it around. It cost $250,000. They started filming in June of 1983 in locations around Australia. June is early winter in Australia, so it was warm during the day and freezing cold at night. The morning of the first day of filming, Mulcahy was extremely nervous. He climbed up a hill to overlook their location for the day and threw up. He thought, "What am I getting myself into?" He was used to music videos where there was no money and no real schedule. This was the largest budget he had ever had up to this point and a very rigid schedule. He wasn't sure if he was going to be able to make it work. Thankfully, his nervousness subsided when the rest of the crew arrived, and they were able to help him get everything underway. With Dean Semler as the director of photography, many of the locations he picked out were ones he used in The Road Warrior. He just shot them from different angles. The film was set mostly in Silverton and Broken Hill. Located to the northeast of Broken Hill was the small town of White Cliffs. It started as an opal mine and is littered with holes all over, making what they called a lunar landscape. They loved the look of the location and planned to use it for a scene later in the film. The hotel was a real hotel in Silverton. The 2 houses were sets they built so they could be destroyed. The stuffed Razorback heads were real that they got from a local taxidermist. With a background of hundreds of hours of shooting music videos, Mulcahy was a visual storyteller. He shot the movie to have enough dialogue to push the film forward, but he leaned more into having the visuals tell the story. The story was already fairly basic, so he didn't want to dump tons of over-explaining to the audience when it clearly wasn't needed. He also felt the visuals would be so spectacular, the audience wouldn't care about the dialogue. Mulcahy had a picture of a car in a tree and wanted to incorporate that into the film. While it was bizarre, it wasn't outside the realm of reality. There was a car that was caught up in a flash flood, which was how it ended up in the tree. In a scene where the Razorback pulls off part of a house, one of the producers pointed out how it would be impossible for the TV to still be on as it pulled away. Mulcahy countered by saying it didn't matter because it looked cool. In a movie with a giant killer pig, most people aren't going to complain about something like that. For the sandstorm in the beginning, they had 3 aircrafts out of frame with their engines on, blowing sand all over. They shot the footage in New York in 1 day, but the interior apartment was on a set in Sydney. The Pet Pack Factory was an abandoned abattoir or slaughterhouse that they brought back to life for the film. Every night the team would return to a pub in Broken Hill, where they had set up a sheet on a large wall where they could project the rushes. Rushes are the raw, unedited footage from the film, also known as dailies. They'd sit around sharing drinks, eating cheese, and were in awe of how good the footage looked. Everyone was having a great time and getting excited over the shoot. There's a scene in the film where Jake shoots one of the pigs. Mulcahy's against killing or hurting an animal for a film, so they set up a tripwire to make the pig fall down. The full-size mechanical pig just didn't look right for the director. Its legs moved, but it couldn't move on its own. It had a steel bar coming out of its backside that they attached to the forklift they were borrowing, which was how they were able to move it around. Mulcahy didn't want it in the movie, but Warner Brothers insisted since they spent $250,000 on it. You can see it once, late in the film, for only a few frames. They had the real pig in its suit on set one day. They were filming a scene where Beth sees the Razorback off in the distance. It was a beautiful shot, and then the pig disappeared when it went over the horizon. They were happy with it, until they realized the pig took off into the outback. They went searching for it and didn't find it until the next day. David Argue did things that gave the director gray hairs. One day he showed up with a big patch of his hair shaved. saying that it was because his character had ringworm. He apparently stayed in character off-set because he was kicked out of the hotel where he was staying for the film. Gregory Harrison did most of his own stunts and took a pretty good beating for it. The worst was when he fell off the windmill. He was strapped to the top, and when it was knocked over, he dislocated his shoulder. He had to finish the film taking painkillers. They were running out of time and money, and they were nearing the end. There was another problem they had to face. There was no real ending to the film. They hadn't agreed on how the pig was going to die, and were running out of time to come up with something. They'd been working for about 10 to 12 weeks, and Bob McCarran and some of his team were very sick. McCarran told the producers, "We still don't know how the pig is going to die. Could somebody please write it?" They decided to wrap the film for now and build a set in Sydney where they could shoot the finale. The set was the interior of the Pet Pack factory. The kangaroo carcasses were really sheep carcasses that they cut up to resemble kangaroos. As the days went by, the bodies started to stink. Every night they'd put them on ice, but it didn't matter because all day they'd be out under the hot lights of the set. They sprayed them with deodorant but couldn't mask the rotting smell. They were on set and the producers said they needed to finish the film tonight. They could only afford to shoot this last day. Finally, they decided the Razorback would die by falling into the giant meat grinder. They put it together and shot the scene. McCarran wasn't happy with it, but at least it was something. They said it was a conclusion, but not a real ending. After seeing the end, they weren't satisfied, so they were able to go to LA to shoot a little more. They put together the ending where Carl finds Sarah, which gives the film a little more closure. They hired Iva Davies from the band Icehouse to do the score. Mulcahy knew him, as he had shot many of the band's music videos. There was supposed to be a dream sequence in the film, but they didn't have time to shoot it. The way they had it now was that Carl fell asleep in the outback and woke up on Sarah's property. Mulcahy took 4 people out to the desert to shoot the sequence. He didn't bother asking the studio because he knew they'd say no. They shot the scenes in a dry lake bed using a double for Gregory Harrison because he had long since left the production. They shot the whole sequence in one day. They experimented with all kinds of things to make the sequence surreal. They played with light filters, colors, and even used a dead horse skeleton they found. They fired flares and used a glass painting in front of the camera as a crater. After filming, Mulcahy worked with the editor William A. Anderson to construct the film. After all was said and done, the movie is said to have cost around $5.5 million. Mulcahy showed the film to Elton John, who liked it. They screened the cut for the Warner Brothers executives, who didn't like it. About 3/4 of the way through the film, when the dog gets run over, many of them walked out. They insisted the film be cut down, as it was far too violent. Mulcahy wanted to make a shocking and disturbing film, but it seemed he succeeded a little too well. They cut down the scene where Beth gets killed. They removed the scene where the Razorback kills Jake, because you can see the beast bite his face off, and then later they find his body covered in bugs. They removed most of the scene where Dicko gets eaten. There were other little edits here and there, but those were the scenes that were most hit. They screened the film in LA, where it was well received, but when it was released, it bombed. Warner Brothers didn't have much faith in it, and only released it in a handful of theaters. US audiences laughed at the film. Warner Brothers didn't want it, so they sold the international rights to another company. This wasn't a smart move, because it did very well in France and Europe, and made a small fortune for the guy who bought it. It was, however, panned in Australia. Mulcahy said there was a review that called the film a $100 million production with a $10 pig. There was supposed to be a big premiere for the film in Broken Hill, since it was filmed there, but the government screened it first, and they were so disgusted by the film, they canceled the premiere. Mulcahy went back to directing music videos, and in a similar fashion, his video for Duran Duran's Wild Boys caught the eye of a producer, who hired him to direct Highlander, which I'll talk about in another video. Dean Semler was off filming another movie when he got a random phone call. He picked it up and the caller said it was Steven Spielberg. Thinking it was a prank, he hung up. Spielberg called back and convinced him he was who he said. He said he saw Razorback and had to know how he got 2 moons in the film. In the scene leading up to the dream sequence, the design team built a giant prop moon they lit up, but didn't realize the real moon was still in frame. Since the whole thing had a lucid, dreamy quality, they left it in. The two got to chatting, and sometime later, Spielberg introduced Semler to Kevin Costner, who hired him to shoot Dances with Wolves, which won him an Oscar in 1991 for Best Cinematography. Archie Whiteley continued acting in movies like Spy Maker, The Secret Life of Ian Fleming, but sadly died in 2001 at the age of 37 of adrenal gland cancer. Razorback is an astonishing film. You go in expecting a movie about a giant killer pig, and instead are treated to a visual feast. I've seen thousands of films, and this one, by far, is one of the best looking films I've ever seen. The dream sequence is incredible, but also the little things like the use of light, shadows, and smoke. It was joked that Mulcahy had to have smoke in every scene, even the one in the kitchen in New York. This attention to detail is sadly lost on so many films. I'm not saying that looks are all that matters. The story in this film didn't need to be overly complicated, and it wasn't. However, when you mix that with some outstanding visuals, you get something special. There are some films that have amazing shots, where this film is littered with them. The cinematography was just brilliant. Mulcahy and Semler together made for an amazing pair. I think they were a little hard on the look of the Razorback. I know the studio wanted them to show the monster more, but they were trying to keep it back like Jaws. I don't think they showed it too much, and when we do see it, I thought it looked good. It has that tangible, in-camera look you get with a physical monster prop. I also liked how they were able to mix in the Baker brothers, so that the Razorback wasn't the only threat. As Mulcahy had wanted, in many ways the Baker boys were a bigger threat than the Beast. The amazing talent that worked on the production shines through, and even though it was lower budgeted, it didn't look it. I'm not sure how much of the production was paid for in beer, but with so many from Mad Max on board, there had to have been at least one transaction paid in the beverage. I was surprised to find out the ending was rushed. When they first showed the meat grinder earlier in the film, I thought that was the setup for what would happen at the end. It was a shock to find out they were flying by the seat of their pants on that one. Mulcahy has a brilliant eye for visuals, and, in my humble opinion, I think his style far exceeds many other music video directors turned film directors. Much like other well-respected directors, he has a style that immediately stands out. You know who directed a project without having to look it up. His films have always stood out as being incredibly stylish. Look at Highlander, Ricochet, and The Shadow. Not to mention he directed some of the most stunning and influential music videos of all time. Total Eclipse of the Heart, Betty Davis Eyes, as well as numerous Duran Duran videos, and over 20 for Elton John. If you have a favorite music video from the 80s, there's a good chance it was directed by Mulcahy. While he still has plenty of work on his plate between music videos, TV shows, and movies, he never fully received the praise from the general public that I think he deserves. Razorback is in my top 2 favorite 80s exploitation movies, right along with The Road Warrior. It's beautiful, creepy, haunting, and more than you could ever ask for in a horror movie about a giant killer pig.
There isn't a season for Razorbacks, girlie.
Then why kill him?
You want to know? There's something about blasting the shit out of a Razorback that brightens up my whole day.